Hey folks, today's episode is made possible by Help Existing, the new podcast from author and award-winning journalist Rachel Krantz. On Help Existing, you will hear Rachel interview a different guest each week to get practical help on a specific aspect of existing. This is a show where highbrow and lowbrow topics happily coexist. You might hear a conversation about how to confront your fear of death one week. And then the next week, you might hear about how to have your first conversation with a partner about kink or whether to have children. Full disclosure, I was on the show recently to talk about how to be a good listener, so you might want to check that out. On the Help Existing podcast, no topic is too taboo or sticky, but all episodes aim to be practically and emotionally helpful for listeners. That's Help Existing, the new podcast from Rachel Krantz. Go check it out, available wherever you get your podcasts. All right. Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Otherppl podcast. My name is Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. It's good to be with you. I have an excellent program for you today. My guest is Hernan Diaz, author of the novel Trust.
We shouldn't be too quick to dismiss fiction from the realm of truth. The novel is inviting the reader to reconsider this hierarchy where history is supposed to provide us with the truth and fiction is just a mere innocuous pastime.
Okay, that was Hernan Diaz. His new novel, once again, is called Trust, available now from Riverhead. The conversation with Hernan Diaz will be happening momentarily. Today's episode is brought to you by IG, publisher of my new novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It is available now in trade paperback and ebook editions. You can also find it in an audiobook edition from Tantor Media and Highbridge Audio. The audiobook is narrated by yours truly. Be Brief and Tell Them Everything explores the themes of creation, creative exasperation, grief, loss, fatherhood, marriage, fate, failure, psychedelic reckoning, and more. It is a book that over time became about its own making. It's a personal story and hopefully a darkly funny one. Once again, the novel is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available now from IG. On a related note, I should let you know that I will be reading at Stories in Echo Park on June 5th here in Los Angeles. That starts at 5 p.m. I will be part of an autofiction reading series hosted by Caitlin Forst. Other readers include Cara Blue Adams, Alexandra Jade, Oliver Zarandi, and others. So if you're in Los Angeles and you want to come out, please join us on June 5th at 5 p.m. at Stories in Echo Park. This episode is also made possible by Tenants Cove Writers Retreat. If you are a writer and you want to get some work done, if you're serious about getting work done on your manuscript, Tenants Cove Writers is a new retreat and workshop that offers rustic and rural glamping, as well as a warm and inspiring creative community. It is happening this summer on a nature preserve of 150 acres in New Brunswick, Canada, from August 7th through the 14th. The retreat will be hosted and moderated by Melissa Scholes-Young, author of the novel Hive, and Peter von Zagazar, author of the memoir The Looking Glass Brother. On-site tuition plus room and board is $2,500, and there are only 4 spots available. This is a small, intimate, limited opportunity retreat. Participants can also arrange a full manuscript review for an additional fee. At Tenants Cove Writers, they're looking for serious writers who seriously want to go into retreat and make some big progress on their writing. For more information, visit tenantscovewriters.com. That's TENNANTS covewriters.com, and join the retreat this summer. One more time, the website is tenantscovewriters.com. Okay, so today on the program, my guest is Hernan Diaz. His new novel is called Trust, available now from Riverhead. Trust is Hernan Diaz's second novel, the much-anticipated follow-up to his first novel, In the Distance, which was published by Coffee House Press to great acclaim in 2017. In the Distance is, by any measure, a remarkable success story in publishing. The manuscript was submitted to Coffee House by Hernan Diaz himself. He was unagented at the time. He did not have a literary agent, and the book was picked up off the slush pile, and the rest is history. In the Distance was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and it won the Soroyan International Prize and the New American Voices Award, among other distinctions. Hernan Diaz is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Writers Award, among other things. He holds a PhD from NYU, and he is also the author of a book on Jorge Luis Borges called Borges, Between History and Eternity. So one of the more exciting writers out there today, and I had a great time meeting Hernan Diaz and talking with him about his excellent new book. Trust is an incredibly intelligent, unexpectedly moving, intricately structured and plotted novel about, among other things, capital and how large amounts of capital are amassed in this world, and in particular in the United States of America. It covers a lot of ground, and it speaks across the ages. It's a wonderful book, and I'm so pleased to get to share this conversation with you guys right now. So here he is, folks. This is Hernan Diaz, and his new novel, one more time, is called Trust.
I'm in Brooklyn. I just came back from a long tour, and it's very nice to be back home. I live in Brooklyn Heights. I'm at home right now. I have my library behind me, and I happen, just by coincidence, to be sitting in front of the shelf full of research of books that I read for Trust.
Okay, so yeah, you did a lot of research for this book, and I think this was one of the first questions that I had for you, because your literary project so far, with In the Distance and now Trust, has a lot to do with American ideals and American narratives, a lot of them self-generated and perpetuated by people in power. This country, like any country, has certain myths that it tends to want to associate itself with. And you're interested in this. You're interested in America's ideas about itself as somebody who is, as I think you've put it, a voluntary American. You're not from the United States originally. You're from Buenos Aires, and then were raised in Sweden and spent time in London, and then now you're in Brooklyn. So you're coming at it with the perspective of an outsider a bit, or somebody who's got kind of some critical distance from it. And with Trust, you're exploring wealth, and in particular the accumulation of capital, the machinery involved in the accumulation of capital, that very act, which is kind of mysterious to so many of us. And so the question that I have for you is, if you're interested in exploring these narratives, and in particular the narratives in Trust, did anything that you discovered in the research process or in the writing process challenge or upend preconceived notions that you might have had? Did you learn anything new or unexpected in the process of doing this book?
That's a beautiful question, and I've learned a few things that were unexpected. The first thing, which I've talked about elsewhere, but it bears repeating, I think, is that even though capital has this mystical place in the American imagination, it's very hard to imagine ourselves as a people and really to define the American dream without making a reference to capital and money and wealth. So although money does occupy this transcendental place in our history and in our consciousness, the discovery that I made once I dove into this somewhat seriously was that this obsession hasn't been reflected in literature that much. There are many novels about class, there are many novels about manners, there are many novels about exploitation, And I'm sure both you and the listeners are running sort of little lists in their minds about all these categories. But I think we're all hard pressed to find novels that are about money itself. This was quite a discovery to me. This dissonance, this disproportion between, on the one hand, the outsized role that wealth and the accumulation of wealth play in American history, and on the other side, how almost priggish the American canon has been when it comes to dealing with money. That's one thing that I expected to find a trove of novels around this topic, and there aren't that many of them, at least to my mind, or that do it, or that address this issue in ways that, to me, are productive. The second thing that I discovered, I don't know if it upended anything, as you said in your question, but it was an intense discovery, is that the novel is set for the most part around the years of the 1929 crash. It goes all the way up to 1985, and it starts actually in the Gilded Age in the late 1880s. But the main action is sort of the boom during the 20s and the depression that followed the 1929 stock market crash. And a fascinating thing that I discovered is that serious economists, the most serious ones, can't really explain why this happened, why the crash happened. It remains. There are many theories. Some of them involve, monetary policy, the relatively new Federal Reserve and how it intervened into the situation, speculation on debt, and so on and so forth. But the truth is, nobody knows what happened and how it can be explained away. And the more I looked into the financial history of the United States, it's very clear that crashes of this kind are baked into the system to a large extent. They're very cyclical. They occur. Of course, the most recent one is the 2008 one, and now we're going through this big slump, and we'll see where it leads. But it was remarkable to see the extent to which these sharp breaks and financial earthquakes are part of the system. One would think that if we believe in the invisible hand of the market, as Adam Smith said, that things would correct themselves before reaching that breaking point, but they don't. Over and over again, they fail to do so.
And your book is about a speculative investor who you've kind of created a mythical figure who is able to intuit and anticipate the fluctuations of the market that you just described with uncanny accuracy, kind of like a math genius. The way that we tend to exalt the super rich. I'm thinking of a guy like Warren Buffett as sort of like there's a mystical air about him because of his success as an investor. There are other examples, but can you talk a little bit about the character that you created at the center of this novel, or I guess the characters that you created and how you built them?
Yes, I appreciate your ambiguity in the question, the character or characters. And perhaps some listeners have not read the book, so the briefest sort of synopsis may be in order. The book opens up with a novel within the novel. It's a whole novel whose character is called Benjamin Rask, and he is most likely the richest man in the world. That's the kind of privilege that I wanted to explore in this novel. And he has all these qualities that you just described. He's sort of a wizard of the market and can almost foresee the future. He's prescient. So this whole novel within the novel comes to a conclusion. And the second section of my book is an unfinished autobiography by, in air quotes, real life tycoon. And we very soon discover that this is the real person on whom that first novel within the novel was based. And the real tycoon is not happy with the way he's been depicted in the book. So he sets out to write this autobiography to set the record straight. This is the plan. So hence your ambiguity, Brad, sort of this character or characters. It's a man with two different incarnations. And to sort of shape him, it was complicated because there's much about him that is very sort of unlikable or that I don't like, but I also wanted to endow him with a deep sense of humanity. I don't want to create sort of a cigar chomping, caricature of a millionaire in the 20s and then proceed to beat him up like a piñata. That would have been just too facile, too simple. I tried to endow him with humanity, with feelings, and we see this mostly in his relationship with his wife. But to get a sense of who he was, I relied heavily on historical documents and autobiographies by great men, in quotes again, and try to find their tone and their unshakable self-assurance. These are all men who believe on the page that their lives have been blameless and that we all really need to hear their tale and learn from their outsized achievements. So he's a complicated figure. He's a very complicated figure, and the novelist sort of explores this complication. But he's outsized in the sense that he also embodies within his own self this chimera of American capital.
It's interesting. We talked just a bit ago about how this book sort of centers itself on capital and the accumulation of capital, and how you found in your research that there was a dearth of this in the American canon. This particular kind of story. There's class novels and there's novels of manners and novels of exploitation, but in terms of the machinery of how capital really works, there wasn't much. And I wonder if it's because it's hard to understand. I think of writers and their temperament in general. I mean, writers are not notorious for being great with money.
Yeah, I belong in that legion of people who are not great with money, sadly. But I read a ton. It was a steep learning curve to write this book, and in the process, I learned there is a Nobel laureate in economics, an American. His name is Paul Romer. He used to be the chief economist for the World Bank and a very, very impressive intellectual in the field. And he coined this term mathiness, which means, of course, there is mathematical sophistication to economics. Nobody in the right mind would deny this obvious fact. But it is equally true that so many matters in economic policy really depend on consensus and are a matter of ideological opinion and implementation of different policies. So what some economists will do is to shroud these more political aspects of finance in mathiness, in sort of a false sense of objectivity, to disguise the fact that these are indeed ideological matters that should be discussed in the public arena. But if you present them as something mathematical, objective, and irrefutable, you are dispensed with this discussion. And this is something I found repeatedly in my research, that things were made to be more arcane than perhaps they ought to have been, or than they really are. And I think the ultimate desired effect is to turn the public off and away from these matters. It's just, we can't be bothered. Let's leave this to the specialists. I fear this is becoming super nerdy and wonky and
no, I think it's important.
On economics. We can switch gears and talk about literature and books any time you want. I
think that this curiosity is at the heart of the character and at the heart of the book in some ways. And I think it's important to address it precisely because it often does not go addressed. Yeah. And, you said something, I'm going to read a quote back to you just because I felt it was very eloquent. And you said something in an interview that you did about money and about this, the way that a lot of times the politics of money get shrouded in the mathiness of it as a way of obfuscating. And you said the self-conscious mystification of money is meant to shut us out of its workings and impart an element of magic to it, magic that only magicians can perform. They are a special class of oppressors whose amoral monkishness we admire. Sometimes we might even look to them as saviors. And I read that, or I think of that, and I think of the way that, just as a popular example, I think of the way that tech CEOs often present themselves with these monkish beards in their austere hoodies.
That's so cool. Oh yeah, like cowls.
Yeah, they have this sort of, they're like resolutely underdressed, and I hadn't given that much thought. I thought, oh, they're just young and they're in their flip-flops or whatever in the office, but it's a way of obfuscating. How harmful could a guy like Mark Zuckerberg be? He's just wearing a hoodie and sandals, and there's a method to that madness, I think, that you're describing, and it applies through the generations.
What is that interview you quoted?
I think that was Harper's.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. You're like, wow, I sound great.
Exactly. It's like,
I said that?
Thank you, Mr. Editor.
Yeah.
I don't think Harper's was an interview, but I'm going to look this up because now I'm curious. We've been doing this for a really, really long time. This is just now the sort of the latest incarnation of this figure, and it's probably because, certain centers of gravity have shifted to the West Coast, and that's a relatively new thing. And with that also comes this sort of a more enlightened and sort of crunchy version of the same idea, But I think you're totally right. At the core of it, I think the unspoken word here is guru. These are all gurus in one way or another. And one of the funny things that I discovered during my research is how coherent certain economic policies have been in the United States over the course of a century. I was looking at the 1920s, and I was writing this almost in the 2020s, right? And the playbook during the Republican administrations at that time, mostly Harding and Coolidge, and the Republican administration or policymakers of today are very much the same. American exceptionalism, America first, tax cuts, radical tax cuts, especially for the wealthy, small government, big business, no regulation of markets at all, tariffs whenever it's convenient for the United States. It was the whole shebang. It was an exact mirror. They stick to their narrative, even if the facts point elsewhere. And this is exactly sort of the articulation that my book is trying to explore. The difference between facts and narratives, and how certain power structures to perpetuate themselves are reliant on narratives. And this is of great interest to me because so much, since we're talking about the fiscal conservative agenda, so much of it is so profoundly irrational and has been disproven by economic theory abundantly, that the only way it can stay in place is by being propped up by different narratives that have to do, let's say, with freedom, with self-determination, with a competitive edge, with, America number one, and all of that. All of those are fictions and narratives. So I think the book, to a large extent, wants to highlight the fact that, yes, sure, literature and the arts in general are conditioned by material circumstances and by historical and economic forces, but the reverse is also true. There is no possibility of a financial or a political power perpetuating itself without the aid of a certain constellation of fictions that legitimize it. So
it reminds me of the conversation that Ida Partenza in the third section of your novel has with her father, who's kind of a radical leftist from Italy, if I'm characterizing that properly, where he's kind of pointing at the skyline of Manhattan and talking about speculative financial transactions and how Wall Street was built, and he's like, it's all fictions. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but kind of a similar line.
Absolutely. There are two things I want to say about what you just said. The first thing is that he's an anarchist, and I feel this is important. Here's another thing that I found during my research, and I put it in the book, so it's in there. Obviously, the Italian presence in the United States at the turn of the century was enormous. It was the largest migratory movement in history at that point.
My great-grandfather and great-grandmother were part of it.
Oh, really?
From Sicily, yeah. Listi is Sicilian.
Yeah. Well, I'm half Italian. I even have an Italian passport. And my maternal grandparents went from Campania to Buenos Aires, but they could just have easily have gone to New York or, I don't know why exactly they decided to go to Argentina, but they did. But all this to say that, the novel is very concerned with that world as well, because it was a world of immense poverty, discrimination, and segregation, just across the East River. And on the other side, you have all this incredible opulence and excess. And within the world of Italian immigrants, the anarchist movement played an outsized role. And it was fascinating to me to see the extent to which their legacy or their presence even has been deleted and ignored and vanished to a large extent. I consulted very serious archives in the process of writing this book, and I was unable to find a single whole collection of an Italian American anarchist paper or magazine anywhere. I'm sure it exists someplace. It was not readily available at any major institution. So that to me says something also about how we as a nation have handled a very important part of our past and decided that it ought to be deleted, or it ought to be neglected to the point that it would become irretrievable. But speaking to that scene that you were mentioning, this anarchist man who is a typesetter and actually prints one of these anarchist newspapers, is walking down sort of the East River around Red Hook with his daughter, Ida Pertenso, who's the narrator and protagonist of this third section of the book. And he does indeed say that the skyline of, downtown Manhattan is a mirage. It's a fiction because money at its core is a fiction, he says. And I have to say I agree with him on this count, because, there's nothing in a $5 bill that inherently endows it with that purchasing power or bestows it with that purchasing power. It's just a convention, and it works. It does have that purchasing power because of our trust in the series of conventions that we have come to accept. But if you take a step back, all money is really monopoly money, all of it. It's just that we have somehow agreed to play the game, and we have agreed that these slips of paper have a real impact on the world, but obviously they don't. So this is the kind of conventions that I was interested in exploring. Money is the most visible, I think, social convention that we have. We may have enormous differences in every other regard, but we all agree that a $5 bill is worth $5.
Right. It's fundamentally strange, money. And this is something that your book really draws into relief and makes you think about when you're reading it. It's just how odd it is. You have said, I think, that the core of this project is an attempt to listen to the humanity that wealth has tried to erase. So you talk about like the Italian anarchists,
that's a good example.
Yeah, whose voices. But you also make a very interesting observation of the world of super high capital and how historically, anyway, it has been almost entirely womanless. It is an exclusively male domain, and this book is seeking to explore that and maybe to rectify some of these deletions and injustices. So I'd like to hear you talk. I mean, we haven't spoken yet about Helen Rask, who is the fictionalized version of Mildred Bevel. So in the first section of the book, you've basically written an entire novel about Benjamin and Helen Rask, who are fictional stand-ins for Andrew and Mildred Bevel, who are, in the world of your novel, the actual people, the actual married couple who
That's right.
accumulated all this capital. So can you just talk a little bit about wealth and erasure and, you know, how this became kind of a driving interest of the novel?
There's a scene in the novel where the tycoon asks his secretary, he says, do you understand what my job is? And she says, no. And he says, well, thank you for not even attempting a response. He's having a bad day. He's very snippy. And he says, my job is to always be right. And whenever I'm wrong, I need to make use of all the resources at my disposal to bend and align reality so that my mistake ceases to be a mistake. And this is, I think, you know, I don't want to summarize the novel to one sentence, because then why write the whole book? But this was a thing that I was thinking about a lot as I was writing the novel, which is, in sufficient amounts, in vast amounts, money starts behaving almost like a black hole. It acquires a mass so large that it, you know, disrupts space-time almost. It really bends reality around it. I think a silly, small little example is how we all kind of act weird around wealth. We stop being natural. I know this is true for me. I don't want to assign it to you, but
no, I understand exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I think most people do, especially if you're around somebody who's really got an absurd amount of money.
Yes.
You can detect it not only in yourself, but you detect it in everybody around them. It really just has a distorting effect.
People behave differently, or when you enter a space that is a space, you know, sort of a temple to wealth, whatever this may be, you know, and it affects you in ways that you can't control and that I dislike very much, you know, and I hate it that I'm not immune to this gravitational force. It does do something to my perception of the world and of myself. And this is a tiny example because who knows, you know, maybe it's just me, but I do firmly believe, because I see it in the news, that wealth in sufficient amounts can do this bending, can do this aligning of reality. And this distortion usually involves a double movement. First, the creation of narratives that self-aggrandize sort of the origin myth of this wealth, because we all know that all wealth is ill-gained at that level. There's just no way that money is legit. There just isn't. It's not possible. So it is necessary to come up with a legitimizing kind of mythology. So that's the first operation. The second operation has to do with precisely deleting the presence of all the people who were effectively crushed in the making of this fortune. Like make a sort of a clean, hygienic narrative of this wealth that excludes the suffering and the silencing and the deletion of all these other people. And what stood out for me was the radical, total absence of women in these narratives. If you read the autobiographies of the great American tycoons, women are not there, or they're just, wives for the most part. And in fiction too, women are not involved in money making. That to me was sadly probably accurate on the one hand, but also a sign of a crushing sense of exclusion, that was real. That was real. This is something that I wanted to revise and to subvert. So I do play with the role of the wife, of the secretary, of the victim, which are the pre-assigned roles that women are pushed into in these narratives about wealth for the most part. And I try to subvert the expectations that come with these roles.
As I was reading your book and thinking about how it is kind of about a battle for control over a story, That's a
Totally.
That's about, it's like it's like a war over narrative. I started to think of recent examples of American business tycoons or power players and comments that they had made that had found their way into the press that stuck to me to a degree that's interesting because I remember them. I remember, for example, all the mythology around Steve Jobs and his infamous, quote, reality distortion field. Like people who had worked with him would talk about how he had a reality distortion field. So if you gave him news or a narrative that he didn't like, he would basically, just say, no, that's not true. This is the truth. And then
really?
The reality distortion field, with Steve
I never
Jobs.
Heard that.
Right.
Yeah.
But it squares very much with like the themes and the activities of your novel. And then even
exactly what I was trying to express with a gravitational pull. It's the same, like the idea of an event horizon in a black hole. It's very it's very similar.
Well, and even more hauntingly, because I actually went and dug up this quote because I remembered it but couldn't paraphrase it for myself sufficiently. Was a quote that Karl Rove made during the George W. Bush presidency, and I'm going to read it just because it's so perfect for a conversation.
I think I know which quote you're going to read, and I was thinking about it during the writing. But please, let's hear Karl Rove.
Karl Rove said, quote, "We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do." Like, if that is not supreme arrogance and chilling, I don't know what is.
Yeah. I thought about that Karl Rove quote a lot, and it feels weird to say that I thought about Karl Rove a lot. But
there's actually a photograph. People listening, you can't see this. There's actually a photograph of Karl Rove hanging in Ernin's study.
Yeah, right. No, I did think about that quite often. I remember when he said that during sort of the Bush administration, and it was utterly mind blowing, and it always stayed with me. I mean, I wasn't thinking of this project back then, of course, at all. But it was so, as he said, chilling, and the hubris of it all is just mind boggling. But I feel that then, like everything, then Trump came and everything seemed suddenly sort of almost benign, in comparison. And I'm not saying it was benign, because I still feel that George W. Bush administrations were genocidal, is the only word I can come up with for now. But most of Trust, my novel, was written during the Trump administration. And it seemed to me then, again, the parallels with the 20s, and, like Harding ran under the slogan "America First." He also claimed to have the best people, businessmen that he appointed to his cabinet. Then his successor, Calvin Coolidge, and his infamous 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. And we were seeing, children being separated at the border. I should also say that the Immigration Quota Act was only for certain specific regions, like mostly Italy and Asia, just like the bans during Trump were only for certain regions, right? And we remember what he called those countries too. So the parallels were uncanny, but also going back to the Karl Rove quote, the extent to which that administration made us doubt, or wanted us to doubt, empirical reality, like things we were witnessing with our own eyes, not even through the media, unfiltered, immediate reality was being put into doubt by that president and his team. And it seemed to me that reality itself was up for grabs. That to me was something I was thinking a lot about, and it still is, with all the false claims about the fraudulent election, and so on and so forth. I think that reality seems to be something that can't that can be bent and aligned, and it is constantly, and it's a terrifying notion, and of course it's amplified by the fact that there seems to be an increasing monopoly over media outlets that makes this very complicated,
Well, it makes me I'm thinking of Howard Zinn.
Sure.
The story that you're telling here, or one of the questions that the story is raising, is who gets to decide how powerful people, powerful men in particular, are remembered.
Right. I think at the core of the book is actually the interrogation of that boundary between history and fiction, because history is part of a constant negotiation. It's not simply a matter of record. Part of it is, of course, but then another part has to do with the interpretation of those records and, how visible part of those records are, and to which extent other sections of those historical records are thrown into the shadows. So it's not just a straightforward linear accumulation of facts along a timeline. That is not how history works. History is first and foremost a narrative. And a narrative is always highly ideological, and it implies a certain contract with the reader. We as readers of history are being asked each time we read a piece of history to take what we are being given at face value and to accept that it is closer to factual truth than, say, any novel. So there is a hierarchy there between fiction and history, where history seems to have a greater claim to objectivity, whereas fiction is a mere make-believe. But our conversation right now is showing us that these distinctions are very unstable, because on the one hand, you see that history resorts to a lot of even rhetorical devices that we associate with literature to begin with. Not only that, history is not as objective as this is a truism. This is obvious to or it should be obvious to most of us, but it bears repeating that history doesn't get sort of this epistemological claim to offer up the truth about the past without any mediation. There are many mediations. On the other hand, I think fiction, if you look back at I can only speak about the literary tradition of the West, but if you look back at, say, the last 2,500 years of Western literature, I think you will find there some sliver of truth about what it means to be a human on planet Earth. So we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss fiction from the realm of truth. I think fiction has been providing us throughout the course of millennia with a very solid record about the human experience. And I, for one, turn to fiction for that way more than I do to history. So again, this may be a long way to say simply that the novel is inviting, I guess is the polite word, is inviting the reader to reconsider this hierarchy where history is supposed to provide us with the truth and fiction is just a mere innocuous pastime. I think both of these discourses owe a lot to one another and have informed each other throughout the course of time. And I think the ways in which one bleeds into the other are interesting, and it's our duty to look into that. I think maybe the truth that we're looking for is in those distortions, actually. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What's coming to mind for me is the feminist quality of this book. I think it's fair to categorize it that way. It's a feminist novel in a lot of ways. I hope
so.
And I feel that the depiction of the Helen Rask / Mildred Bevel character is very deftly done. And I don't want to talk too much. I mean, she's so much to me the heart of the novel, but I don't want to talk too much about her because I don't want to give too much away. This is one of those novels that's difficult to talk about because, you run the risk of, of spoiling. But a question that I will ask has to do with your research process as you were setting about to build the Mildred Bevel character, and what you discovered about the women of, especially past eras in American life in these higher echelons. You talked about reading the autobiographies of great men and how these were pretty womanless tales. They didn't have a lot of primary, importance in the way that these stories were depicted by the men themselves. But you did, I think, if I remember correctly, in your research process, read some diaries of women who sort of sat at the right hand or whatever of these really wealthy men.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know what you learned about their lives and how that factored into the building of Mildred.
Well, I that part of my work was sort of twofold. On the one hand, I read a lot of journals which are behind me next to the Karl Rove portrait.
It's a beautiful oil painting. I don't know where you must have had that commissioned.
I did. Actually, it's George W. Bush.
I was going to say, he did.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, I know. Also, for the record, I don't have a Karl Rove picture behind me.
He's in a bathtub, which is a little bit disturbing, but that is a motif that George W. Bush likes to work in.
What's up with the bathtubs? Yes. Anyway, so on the one hand, I read a lot of beautiful, very moving journals from the period, which is a period in literature that I love. I love high modernism. I like the experimental nature of that literature, and I think it's a type of literature that is very invested in the exploration of selfhood, and it's an inward-looking kind of literature. And that interior gaze also implies, a new way of writing. There's a new syntax, there's a new pace, there's a new texture, and I'm fascinated with this period, just as I'm fascinated with the literature that precedes it, like the literature of Henry James or Constance Fenimore Wilson or Edith Wharton, sort of turn of the century American literature that I love. So I read this on the one hand, and on the other hand, I did archival research and went to private collections of some of these tycoons, for the most part in New York, and asked to look at their wives' papers. And what I found, for the most part, was a great sense of oppression. And maybe I'm sort of imposing this on the papers, and it's something that I felt but wasn't there. I'm just saying what my encounter was like. There were many lists, there were many blank days. There was a sense of suffocation to me. But the most chilling thing that I found was that none of these papers had been opened since they had been archived. So for the most part, nobody had looked at these women's personal papers in like 100 years. And that to me was the most eloquent silence that I found in the whole writing process. I would say is the fact that still to this day, not only had these women been sort of marginalized and pushed into these sort of very menial roles, but also to this day, people don't seem to care about what they had to say, And I think there's probably a number of ways in which these collections could be activated and turned into something interesting. And maybe they have, for all I know. I don't know. I haven't looked at sort of all the exhibits of these libraries in the past 100 years, so I could be totally mistaken about this, but I'm not mistaken about the fact that many of these archival boxes had never been opened, because you can tell if you've ever done this kind of work. You can tell. There's something poignant about that. Imagine leaving your papers behind, thinking like, I'm going to leave these behind for future scholars, and then it takes 100 years for anybody to crack into it. Yeah, I don't know if it's scholars or it's just how yeah, it's just how relegated they have been and unworthy, it seems, of anyone's interest. It was, yeah, poignant is, I guess, the right word. It was very sad. It really was.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I don't want to leave you without talking a bit about your biography, which I find interesting. Touched on it maybe a little bit at the top. You were born in Buenos Aires, and then your father was as I read about, was a leftist filmmaker, and you had to kind of flee due to political unrest when you were very young.
Yes.
Okay, and then you wound up in Sweden.
That's right. Yeah, I spent my early childhood, or I think we moved back when I was about 11 or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
yes.
We'll just continue because it's just interesting to me because you lived in a lot of different places.
Oh, so we moved back with the return of democracy. We went back to Argentina. My parents decided they wanted to go back, and I didn't feel fully at home, but I did my undergrad there. But I knew I wanted to leave, and specifically I knew I wanted to be in an English-speaking country. I fell in love with the English language. So I finished my degree as quickly as I possibly could, and then applied for a scholarship and got a grant from the British Council, and I moved to London for a couple of years. And then I came to NYU immediately after that, and I've been living here in New York City for, I think 23 years now. Always in Brooklyn, different parts of Brooklyn, but always a Brooklyn address.
And you got your PhD at NYU?
I did, yeah.
What did you get your PhD in? I'm curious.
Well, I started out in the Spanish department because, it seemed like the easiest way to get in.
Yeah.
But then I ended up with a comparative literature project that was about different forms of isolation in modern literature, not only in Spanish. It was heavy on English and American literature, and I was very into literary theory and philosophy. Like I picked NYU because Jacques Derrida was teaching there, so I thought, it would be cool to take Derrida's seminar, and I was very.
Did you take a
invested.
seminar?
I did. Every year when he taught it, I would take it. It was, when I say seminar, I mean, when you hear seminar, you probably imagine like a round table and people with their cups of coffee. It was, it was over 100 people in a very large sort of auditorium style classroom. It wasn't an intimate thing, but you could go to his office hours and stuff. But I thought for a while that was what I wanted to do, something more in that field, in theory or philosophy, or becoming a scholar, which I did for a while. But I always wrote fiction simultaneously, and then a number of reasons, personal, institutional, and so on, led me to really take the plunge and devote myself to writing. It was terrible at first. I mean, not the writing itself, but nobody would touch my stuff. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher. I didn't have connections. I didn't have anything. And so it was many years of total and absolute rejection. So if there are, aspiring writers or unpublished writers who are listening to this, please know that that's the more common narrative, sort of the first, over a decade of just nothing happening. But I kept writing, of course. It's just it was all invisible, novels and short stories. Yeah. Okay.
And then it's nice to hear you talk about that part of it, because the trajectory that you've been on since In the Distance published has been kind of the dream trajectory for a writer of literary fiction. And for those people listening who don't know the story, I want to give them a thumbnail. In the Distance, your debut novel, was submitted without an agent to Coffee House Press. They picked it up off the slush pile, accepted it for publication. It went on to be nominated for the PEN/Faulkner, I believe, and the Pulitzer Prize. Is that right?
Yes.
It won some other awards. So this is like the stuff of movies, right? For a book to get picked up off the slush pile and to have that kind of critical reception and publication success. But I think for the outside person looking in, they might hear that and be like, wow, what a lucky guy. He got picked up off the slush pile. He's the one in a million. But they don't hear about the 10 years that you spent failing and continuing to try over and over again to get to the point where that happened.
And not being picked up from the slush pile, like and the stack of rejection letters and emails that I stopped collecting, really, because it just got ridiculous. It was too much and too depressing. And so no, it wasn't. It was immensely lucky. I won't take that away. Like, that is obviously a factor. The right person, the right time, the right mood, the right even like political context for something to click. There's so many things that have to align that don't depend on anyone, because they're collective things. They're not under anyone's control. If there were, people would control them, and but you can't. So there is that element, but I can't emphasize this enough. Like, writing for those reasons is just the wrong reason to write. The only good reason to become a writer, because it's very lonely. It's very, to me at least, destabilizing. Like, it's a world of self-doubt all the time and self-questioning. And there is no money in general in it. So the only reason to do it is because you love being in language, because that is your world, your medium. It's where you feel good. It's your home. And I feel at home in language, and very specifically in the English language. And I enjoy being in there. I enjoy sort of lexical challenges. What is the right word for this emotion? And I enjoy the architectural dimension of putting together a plot. All of these things I love doing, and reading, of course. And that's why you do it. And all the other stuff, I mean, of course it's welcome, because it allows you to do it more comfortably and with less pressure, and with, it's more fun when you're not rejected all the time.
Sure, yeah.
It is a lot more fun not to be rejected. And also you start feeling a little crazy when you're rejected for years and years and years, because you keep at it despite the world telling you to please stop.
Right. I know that feeling. I know that feeling where you're
exactly.
you're like, you do question your sanity. You go, am I crazy for having spent years of my life at this?
Yes.
And then to have somebody say yes is such a relief. That's the word that
It is a relief.
Yeah.
It is a relief because you do feel slightly insane, or very insane. And so that is in a nutshell the story. And to this day, sometimes I will send stories out and they are still rejected, this time through my agent, which is much nicer. But I think it's a good thing that there's still stories that are rejected, because it means that hopefully, maybe they're just rejected because they suck. That is most likely the reason. But also, it could be that they're pushing against something, and they feel hopefully weird and inadequate in ways that I hope to keep alive as a writer, like not writing the thing that is expected and that is streamlined to go straight into to print. I hope to be rejected to some extent in the future still, because that means I'm trying to do something new, and that's something that I try to keep alive for myself.
So let me ask you a question about In the Distance, your debut novel that Coffee House published and was nominated for the Pulitzer. Because this was the breakthrough for you, this was the book that got the yes. With the benefit of hindsight, was there something that you experienced in the writing of the novel that indicated to you that this one had a good chance of working, whereas maybe previous efforts didn't have or create a similar feeling to you? Was there anything distinguishing about it?
Well, I liked it better. I don't put out things that I don't like. I'm not that kind of writer. And by putting out, I mean even to a publisher or a submission or now my agent, or I only submit things when they are really done to me. And sometimes that takes a long time. And of course, I suffer from the same thing we all do. Like I see it then on the page, printed, and I discover a million small things. But still, by and large, I stand by the whole book or story or whatever it is. So I don't know. I think it was better than what I had written before. But that's something we all hope for ourselves in whatever it is that we do, right? I can't pinpoint, or I can't, point to anything in particular that sort of made that book. Again, because then maybe I would try to replicate that in the future. Just to make sure that I can keep paying my bills. But I honestly don't know. It's just I try to write with as much rigor and as much emotion as I can. Those are the two things that I try to do. To try to write with feeling, and to try to write with enormous accuracy and linguistic sort of rigor. These two things tend to cancel each other out, right? Emotion and this other side of trying to make things really as tight as they can possibly be. So it's hard to keep both things equally intense on the page.
Well, I'm imagining you're going to say something to that effect when I ask you my next question, which is a question about follow-up. Like having such a great success with this debut that sort of defied the odds and made such a splash, and then to have Trust come out on a major press, and this is your follow-up to In the Distance, and there are expectations that are either real or imagined around your sophomore effort, and I just want to hear you talk about managing especially the emotional content of that, trying to keep your focus and not let that get to you, because I could imagine how it would. Can you just describe what you did to kind of keep yourself on an even keel as you approached the writing of Trust?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie and pretend that or tell you that I'm writing in a vacuum, and that each new project is fresh, and what I did previously has no bearing on what I'm doing now. That is simply not true. And now, for instance, I just finished Trust, and I'm at the stage of thinking of a new project, and even knowing that the Trust is now out in the world has an effect on me. I feel I need to echo myself here and really say again that to me it's about rediscovering again the joy of language, and I find that, for instance, at this stage in reading, so I'm catching up with books that I've always wanted to read, books that only pleasure. There's nothing at this point that I'm reading that is a chore. Like if I don't like a book, I put it down and pick a new one. It has to be. I have to find that joy in language, as I said before, and then once an idea gains traction in my mind, and at the moment I have a couple battling each other out, and I'm letting them do the work, and whoever prevails, I think, will be the whatever prevails will be what I'll do. But it'll take a little time to see which one I'm feeling more intensely. But once that has been established, I honestly love writing so much that it takes over all the other considerations. It doesn't really matter. Then they resurface every now and then, and I wonder, oh, how will this do? Will I be able to place it? Normal questions that I think any reasonable writer asks themselves, because you want your creature sort of to fare well. You don't want it to get stranded. Again, I've had my fair share of that, and it doesn't feel great, especially with a novel, which is years of your life. So I think the answer to your question is always in the work. It's always in the work. There's something when things start clicking, and again, I'm speaking to all the writers who hopefully are tuning in, and hopefully they will know this feeling when you are almost. I don't surf. I don't do any sports at all, but I imagine that must be what surfing must feel like. You finally caught the wave and you're gliding along with it, and everything is in balance, and you're there with the elements, and a certain velocity, and you're part of it because you have to keep yourself going and upright and everything. But there is also a passive element. You're being carried by the wave, and that is when I finally get there, everything else vanishes. Please don't ask me where the surfing metaphor came from. You are in California. I'm in Brooklyn. I'm a city boy. I don't think I've ever touched a surfboard. But there you go.
I feel like Ernin might be writing a surfing novel sometime in the future. Who knows? This could be part of his future.
I do love the Beach Boys.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Well, I have so enjoyed talking with you, and congratulate you on Trust, which is a big achievement. There's a lot that we talked about, but there's a lot more to discover for readers. It's a very, what's the word? Intellectually robust and beautifully rendered, like Russian nesting doll kind of novel. It's a great puzzle, and a lot of it came to me as I was reading, with the feeling of wonderful surprise, which I always love in fiction. So kudos to you. I know, I can only imagine how much work went into it, and I know it's been getting a great reception. So I congratulate you, and I thank you for your time.
Oh, Brad, it's been such a pleasure and such an honor to be on. I've been doing a bunch of these, but this conversation was really, truly a pleasure. I'm so grateful.
Okay, guys, there you go. That was Hernan Diaz. His new novel is called Trust. It's available now from Riverhead. You can find Hernan Diaz on the internet at hernandiaz.net. I do not believe he has any social media accounts. One more time, the novel is called Trust. It is superb. Go get your copy right away. The Otherppl podcast is offered freely every single episode of this show, almost 800 episodes and counting. They are all made available to you, the listener, free of charge. It's a listener-supported show. This show depends on your support, so if you listen regularly, if you like it, if you get something from it, I hope you will consider supporting it. To do so, just visit patreon.com/otherpplpod. That's Patreon, patreon.com/otherpplpod. There are different tiers, different levels of support. I try to make it easy on you. You can support this show for as little as $1 a month, or you can move up the scale. As you do so, you can get stuff: a t-shirt, a tote bag, a coffee mug, a sticker, a book club subscription. I will write you a postcard. I will wish you a happy birthday. Check it out. Support the show at patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you would like to get a copy of my new novel, it's out there now in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. Once again, the audiobook is voiced and narrated by yours truly. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Go get it. There are new t-shirts available. New Other People t-shirts. Did you know that? There's some new merch. If you want to check that out, go to otherppl.com, the show's official website. And you should know, too, that I redesigned the show's official website recently, otherppl.com. So if you want to check that out, go right ahead. The Other People podcast has its own official app. It's a great way to listen. Go get the Other People app wherever you get your apps. Just search for it by name, Otherppl. The Other People podcast is also available on YouTube. So if you're a YouTube person, check out the Other People YouTube channel. Search for it by name, Otherppl, and subscribe. It's free. Every single episode of this show, almost 800 and counting, is available to listen to on YouTube. All right? So, great episode today. Fun to talk with Hernan Diaz. I will be back next week with more conversations, another conversation, another episode in public.